Historians, what's the funniest/most ridiculous story from history that you know of? Story 1. Taken from the wiki page, which has information from the Russian Primary Chronicle, the following account is taken from the Primary Chronicle. Princess Olga was the wife of Igor of Kiev, who was killed by the Drevlians. At the time of her husband's death, their son Sviatoslav was 3 years old, making Olga the official ruler of Kievan Rus until he reached adulthood. The Drevlians wanted Olga to marry their prince Mal, making him the ruler of Kievan Rus, but Olga was determined to remain in power and preserve it for her son. The Drevlians sent 20 of their best men to persuade Olga to marry their prince Mal and give up her rule of Kievan Rus. She had them buried alive. Then she sent word to Prince Mal that she accepted the proposal, but required their most distinguished men to accompany her on the journey in order for her people to accept the offer of marriage. The Drevlians sent the best men who governed their land. Upon their arrival, she offered them a warm welcome and an invitation to clean up after the long journey in a bathhouse. After they entered, she locked the doors and set fire to the building, burning them alive. With the best and wisest men out of the way, she planned to destroy the remaining Drevlians. She invited them to a funeral feast so she could mourn over her husband's grave. Her servants waited on them, and after the Drevlians were drunk, Olga's soldiers killed over 5,000 of them. She then placed the city under siege. She asked for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. She claimed she did not want to burden the villagers any further after the siege. They were happy to comply with the request. Now Olga gave to each soldier in her army a pigeon or a sparrow and ordered them to attach by thread to each bird a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth. When night fell, Olga bade her soldiers release the pigeons and the sparrows. So the birds flew to their nests, the pigeons to the cotes, and the sparrows under the eaves. The dovecotes, the coops, the porches, and the haymows were set on fire. There was not a house that was not consumed, and it was impossible to extinguish the flames because all the houses caught on fire at once. The people fled from the city, and Olga ordered her soldiers to catch them. Thus she took the city and burned it, and captured the elders of the city. Some of the other captives she killed, while some she gave as slaves to her followers. The remnants she left to pay the tribute burned down a whole city with birds. I'd say that's pretty ridiculous. Story 2. Not a historian, so I may get some things wrong, but I like the poop show that was the German walled city of Münster during the Reformation. Basically, Münster was one of the last few German cities holding out from becoming Lutheran, until a Protestant revolt took place and kicked out the bishop and all of the Catholics, who promptly took almost all of the money in the city with them as they occupied the higher levels of society. To try and win back over the Catholics, the Lutheran leaders then became one of the first European cities to issue a declaration of religious toleration. Regrettably, the only ones who came to Münster were Anabaptists. The only group Catholics and Lutherans could agree were freaking bonkers. This group was led by the polygamist John of Leyden, who claimed that Münster was to be the second Jerusalem and that the Christians were to prepare the city, promptly kicking the Lutherans out and taking control of the city. Outside the walls, Catholics and Lutherans have made an agreement to siege and retake the city, and upon finding this out, John shut the walls. The problem was, the Lutherans also took all of the money and a good bit of the food in the city with them, and so they barely had to siege the city before. Story 3. It's not a very funny setting, but I love the Colditz Castle, Oflag IVC POW Camp, escape attempts of World War II, which include hiding in a tea chest, mostly funny because the escapee was so short, he was known as the medium-sized man, dressing up in drag, making and using the classic bedsheet rope, digging many, many tunnels, building an entire freaking glider behind an entire fake wall in an attic. A few prisoners also became ghosts, meaning they remained inside the castle but could not be found by the Germans. They began starving, and John opened the walls and begged the besiegers not to hurt his people, a request they did not grant him. Leyden, along with 2 of his cohorts, were ripped apart by white-hot tongs, with Leyden, for his polygamy, having his nether parts ripped off with the tongs before being disemboweled. After their deaths, the 3 were strung up in cages hanging from the Cathedral of Münster, and the cages are still freaking there today. Story 4. I may have posted this before, but Appian's history of early Rome was some pretty wild stuff. My favorite is from the Samnite History 7.2, page 79 of Loeb, concerning the embassy sent to Tarentum to demand that the prisoners who had been taken there be surrendered. The Tarentines made difficulties about admitting the embassy to their council at all, and when they had received them, jeered at them whenever they made a slip in their Greek, and made fun of their togas and the purple stripe upon them. But a certain Philonides, a fellow fond of jest and ribaldry, going up to Postumius, the chief of the embassy, turned his back to him, drew up his dress, and polluted him with his filth. The spectacle was received with laughter by the bystanders. Basically, Tarentum was a Greek settlement in Italy. They had taken some prisoners who were Roman allies. Rome sent an ambassador to demand their release, so some guy projectile diarrheaed on the ambassador. Naturally, it did not end well for the Tarentines. Story 5. Dr. James Barry was an incredible doctor who was known for being the hardest creature they had ever met by people like Florence Nightingale. At one point, the guy got his hot-headed butt into a pistol duel where he shot the hat off his opponent while taking a bullet to the leg. He immediately got to work pulling it out and patching himself out so that it impressed the officer he was dueling against, and they became close friends. He was the first British military/Irish person to perform a successful C-section where both the mother and child survived, long before anesthesia properly existed. After his death, it was revealed that he was born female, but lived almost his entire life as a man. The British Army, so ashamed, sealed his records for over 100 years, as if that was going to prevent anyone from knowing that one of their best and most influential doctors of all time, who was a hardened bad butt, was female. Story 6. There's a lot of myth surrounding Minamoto no Takemoto. He is believed to be this ridiculous archer standing at 2 meters tall. After losing in a war to his older brother, he is exiled to an island. Well, the winners of the war realized, poop, we shouldn't just leave him there. He might come back for revenge one day. So they sent a small fleet after him. He supposedly took down an entire ship via bow and arrow, but there were too many people. So he retreated back to his place and waited for the men pursuing him. When they arrived, he stood up, cut open his belly, and started throwing his guts at them. This is also possibly the first record of seppuku. He is also the supposed father of the first king of Okinawa, which gave justification to the Japanese people for the control over Okinawa. Story 7. Okay. Number 1. Battle of Karansebes, modern-day Romania. Austrian army is sent out during the Austro-Turkish War. A unit is split up to cover more ground or something. The two halves meet up again, and because of the different languages the soldiers spoke, and maybe a tad bit of drunkenness, the two units were confused and started firing at each other. Number 2. The 12 Battles of the Isonzo. Italian forces engaged in 12 separate battles with Austro-Hungarian forces during World War I around the Isonzo, Soca nowadays, river. Most of the fighting was in present-day Slovenia and Italy. The Italians won 5 times, the Austro-Hungarians thrice, 3 inconclusive, and in the end, the Austro-Hungarians won. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of this video and have a wonderful day. Story 8. Hear the story of St. Lawrence. He was the church's treasurer in the early days, 3rd century CE, back when Christians were still low on the food chain. When the Roman emperor had the pope beheaded and demanded the church's riches from Lawrence, he divided them among the faithful and then presented a group of poor, orphans, lepers, etc. to the emperor, proclaiming that these people were the Christians' true treasures. The Romans were not happy about that, so they had him tortured and then executed by roasting him on a grill. After he was lying on the grill on his back for some time, he allegedly said, "I'm quite well done on this side, you can flip me now." To this day, St. Lawrence is the patron saint of chefs and comedians alike. Story 9. War in the 6th century was usually a fairly brutal affair. When a city was captured, its people were often enslaved or killed. So when, during the Byzantine Sassanid Wars, Khosrow I of Persia successfully besieged Antioch, its inhabitants were understandably somewhat nervous. However, rather than enslaving them or killing them, Khosrow brought the city's population in its entirety back to Persia and rebuilt them an almost exact replica of Antioch, down to the layout of the city and rooms in the houses. The people were freed and made into full Persian citizens. The city was named Weh Antioch Khosrow, Khosrow's better Antioch, and he took great pride in ensuring that it saw greater prosperity than the Byzantine version. Story 10. I'm personally a huge fan of the story of the Siege of Tyre. Tyre was an ancient city, massively fortified, basically an impregnable island fortress. Now, impregnable isn't a word Alexander the Great is okay with. Confronted with the reality that, besieging an island fortress that has a powerful navy is a difficult, almost impossible endeavor, Alexander the amazingly persistent decided on the only reasonable course of action left to him: turn the island into a peninsula by building a huge land bridge. Too long didn't read. "You can't conquer an island fortress," said Tyre. "Then I'll make you not an island," said Alexander the more than adequate. Story 11. Diamond Jim Brady was one of the richest men in late 19th century America. He was famous for living large, throwing lavish parties, and as a big eater, when he threw a party at Delmonico's in New York, they saved the champagne corks, and he was never happier than when they were brought to him in a couple of laundry baskets. He was also a teetotaler. He never drank wine or liquor because he believed them to be bad for his health. Instead, he drank orange juice by the gallon. He died of kidney stones, which his doctor blamed on drinking too much orange juice. Story 12. More like darkly comedic and ridiculous, but here goes. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in hip-deep water. He was a Holy Roman Emperor and was committing a huge force, I think one of the biggest, to a crusade, and was on his way to the Holy Land when they had to cross a river. He took his horse in, and the water was so cold, so the horse threw him. This landed him in approximately hip-deep water, but since he was wearing armor, he couldn't get out, and he drowned. His whole force then went into a panic and either turned back or killed themselves. Pretty crazy stuff. Story 13. Not a historian, but my mom tells stories from living in Key West in the 80s. My favorite is the Conch Republic. Basically, coke was the main source of income for them at the time, and Florida cracked down on smuggling, searching cars, etc. In response, Key West withdrew from the U.S., called themselves the Conch Republic, declared war, fired one shot at the mainland, then surrendered and requested federal aid. I have absolutely no idea if it's true, but it used to make me cackle. Story 14. When William of Normandy, a.k.a. William I, a.k.a. William the Conqueror, a.k.a. William the Mustard, died, various circumstances led to too much time passing before he was embalmed and buried. When the assorted nobility finally got around to shoving his bloated corpse into his stone sarcophagus, he burst. In the words of Orderic Vitalis, the swollen bowels burst, and an intolerable stench assailed the nostrils of the bystanders and the whole crowd. Story 15. The Battle of Reisenai as well. A bunch of German panzers ran into a Russian tank unit and fought for several days. Most Germans were impressed by how strong the KV tanks were. Eventually, the Germans won and stopped to get out of their tanks and inspect a destroyed KV-1 or KV-2. Accounts vary. They started banging on the hull, and the turret started rotating. The crew was only stunned and still alive. The Germans had to shove grenades into the viewports to finally kill the crew. Story 16. Alexander the Great was sacking a city that had a big wall around it. His men camped around the city in the form of a siege. 2 soldiers got quite drunk and then got into an argument about who killed more. They both armored up and went to a nearby gate, where they started fighting the city's army as they exited. Eventually, a full-blown battle erupted between Alexander's army and the city's, with Alexander almost winning. Story 17. From Wikipedia. One ancient account of the death of Chrysippus, the 3rd century BC Greek Stoic philosopher, tells that he died of laughter after he saw a donkey eating his figs. He told a slave to give the donkey neat wine with which to wash them down, and then, having laughed too much, he died. A dude literally laughed himself to death after seeing a butt-eating fruit. Story 18. The Habsburgs were inbred as Frick. Poor Charles II got totally screwed over by this, and when he died, the physician who performed his autopsy stated his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Story 19. The Lone Viking at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Norwegians versus the English. Supposedly, this one Viking held the bridge, and nobody could kill him until an archer went under the bridge and shot him in the balls. That, or how jolly old St. Nicholas punched a heretic in the face at the Council of Nicaea. Story 20. When the composer Rachmaninoff wanted to befriend Stravinsky, also a composer, Rachmaninoff remembered Stravinsky casually mentioning as a part of a story that he enjoyed honey. Rachmaninoff showed up at his door in the middle of the night with a gigantic jar of honey. Story 21. Philip II telling the Spartans if he came down there, he'd kick their butt, and they replied, if. And then Philip decided not to because Sparta were so weak and insignificant that adding them to his rapidly growing empire wasn't worth the time when there were other lands to go conquer. Story 22. Winnie the Pooh came from a bear beloved of English children that lived in a London zoo. The bear was the mascot of a Canadian Army unit and was given to the zoo when the soldiers returned to Canada after World War I. Winnie is short for Winnipeg, the bear's real name. Story 23. The Roman Emperor Valentinian died by self-induced brain aneurysm triggered when he screamed his head off at representatives from a confederation of German tribes that refused to make promises of peace. His death is my favorite imperial death in Roman history. My favorite Roman emperor in general is Emperor Pupienus. That's his real name. Pupienus. Look it up. Story 24. Roland the Farter was a court jester in the 13th century who was given a 30-acre farm and manor house by King Henry II. In return, he was required to entertain at the king's annual Christmas party with an act called a leap, a whistle, and a fart. Story 25. Circumcision was largely made popular in the U.S. by John Harvey Kellogg, of cornflakes fame. Also, cornflakes were originally made and sold as part of an anti-touching-yourself diet, invented by Kellogg and his brother. Weird dude. Story 26. Andrew Jackson's assassination attempt. The fellow ran up to him and tried to shoot him and had a misfire. Luckily, he had another pistol, tried to shoot him again and had another misfire. Andrew proceeded to beat him with his cane. Story 27. Johnny Cash was the first American to hear about the death of Joseph Stalin. He was working as a radio operator for the military at the time of Stalin's death and was the first person to receive the message. Story 28. We have written evidence from some ancient Greek called Xenophon about him kissing his dog on the lips. This man lived about 2,000 years ago. Story 29. David Ogilvy said the funniest line in his school history book was, "The Austrians held the Po while the Italians slowly evacuated." Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.